Welcome, everybody. My name's Mel Dodd. I'm the Programme Director of Spatial Practices here at Central St Martin's. A very warm welcome to our audience, of which we have around 160 guests from the outside world. That's brilliant for a topic such as this. It's so exciting, obviously. And also welcome to staff and students of Spatial Practices, and maybe we even have some of other art college colleagues. I'm going to hand over to Ollie to introduce our evening fundamentals debate, which is entitled Build. But before I do so, I just wanted to, besides saying welcome, I just want to say that the debate series has been absolutely brilliant. This is the final debate. It's an evening event, but we have one more event to really finish this series off in a good way, and that's called Labour. It's a symposium. bad words tonight. It was that warm beer that the students gave me. It's called Labour, and it's Friday and Saturday next week. We have some absolutely amazing international guests, so this is really an opportunity to draw discussions that have happened along the way in the debates and really start to have broader discussions with people from overseas. We have Who Builds Your Architecture, which is a collective group researching the labour forces of global architecture. We have Precarious Workers Brigade. We have Concrete Action, Adam Khaa. We have Peggy Diemer, who runs the architecture lobby, Renier de Graaf from director at OMA, author of 4 Walls and a Roof. Thank you, Shumi. And our own Jeremy Till. So that's a real star lineup, and that is a Friday afternoon and Saturday. So please consider booking tickets to external audience, and staff and students, please come. You are obviously free, and that will mark the end of the series. So be prepared to warm up and get involved in the debate section of this debate after the panellists have spoken. So sharpen your questions, and I'll hand over to Ollie to introduce. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Mel, and thank you all for coming to the third and final debate in this fundamentals series, The Way We Work, before next weekend's symposium on labour. So far, we've tackled architectural education, which is, we always say it's in crisis, and we've seen 4 alternatives for how to dig ourselves out of its current crisis. We focused on working practices. 2 weeks ago, looked at the culture of internships and heard about an exciting new union for architects to join. And tonight, in Build, we're looking at procurement, which is a word that I think for 5 years of my architectural education wasn't mentioned once. And yet, it's the thing that now, writing about architecture, I'm kind of faced with relentlessly whenever I go and visit architects and ask them what the biggest obstacles standing in their way to a better quality built environment is. They always whinge about procurement, which, when I started this job, to be honest, didn't really know what it meant. It's the endless barriers that stand in architects' way between their amazing visionary ideas and actually seeing them realized, seeing the ability to win work. It's the topic that comes up the most, the obstacles that stand in their way, whether it's filling out endless pre-qualification questionnaires with onerous turnover requirements, or the kind of catch-22 chicken and egg situation that you're not allowed to design a kind of building unless you've designed one already. And this isn't just a thing facing young practices. I went to see Richard Rogers' practice the other day, and they were moaning about not being allowed to design schools, finding it difficult to get on frameworks for educational projects and even healthcare projects, despite the fact they've designed several hospitals in the past. Even if architects do qualify for these projects, they're often facing an incredibly Byzantine form of assessment. Recently, Bennie, who's going to be speaking tonight, picked out some local authority kind of processes of procurement where the marks were weighted, 50% of the marks went to your fee bid, and only 17% went on design quality. So you're being judged on how low you're willing to bid for so many public sector projects. At the same time, these procurement processes have become incredibly cumbersome and wasteful and expensive, often costing up to 30% of a contract's value. That's just the process of getting the work can cost that much. And they're relentlessly geared towards minimizing risk. We're seeing kind of contractor-led development where the architect is often sidelined, often cut out of the process altogether. And as we've seen with the Grenfell Tower tragedy, it's doing nothing at all but passing the buck further down the supply chain until the risk actually ends up with the public themselves, the people that have to use these buildings. So, with me to discuss these issues and many more tonight, we have 4 experts from the world of procurement in both public and private sectors. We're going to kick off with Claire Bennie, who's Director of Municipal and former Design Director and Development Director of Peabody. After Claire, we're going to hear from Russell Curtis from RCKa Architects and Project Compass. Then we'll hear from Hughes, who was former head of design for London 2012 Olympics and now runs Khaa. And finally, we'll have Malcolm Redding, founder of Malcolm Redding Consultants, probably the world's leading organizer of architectural competitions. Now, I'm going to introduce them each individually in turn, but we'll kick off with Claire. So, Claire Bennie, Director of Municipal, a consultancy which advises public sector clients on procuring housing, described as a housing development consultancy with a soul. Claire was formerly Development Director at Peabody, where she led an award-winning program of over 5,000 new-build homes and pioneered smarter procurement processes to open up the process to smaller practices. So, over to Claire.
Hello. You may have read some quite ranty articles I've written recently on procurement, and there's actually plenty to be exasperated about. But I actually want to make a plea that we in this room tonight mustn't descend into hurt whinging like I do, and I'm sure other people in the room do, and act like spoilt aesthetes who are shunned by the big bad world. Actually, I think what we've got to do is 3 things. Understand the pressures and drivers of clients, and that's especially the public sector. Procurement really means public sector. The private sector can pick whoever they like to design anything. We've got to promote what architects can do which will ease that pressure and help those clients. And we've got to campaign to change the culture of what housing, and that's my expertise, so sorry if I focus on that, should be and what it should do for our society. So there is the big question which I'm going to plan to answer. Let's talk about those pressures. First of all, we have to set out who housing's for. So whose housing is it anyway? Actually, it's so often forgotten. All housing clients get stuck into a rut of believing that if they're paying the designer or the developer, then actually it's all about them and their immediate priorities, and it isn't. Especially not if you're planning to build on public land. There is a far wider duty on you. You've got to meet all these stakeholders, and sorry to call them that, priorities. So if you're designing for the planet, it's got to be low impact. The citizen, we all walk past housing. It's got to look fantastic. I don't care if I only walk past it once a day and don't live in it. It matters to me what that housing is like. It speaks of the values of my generation. If I'm a landlord, it's got to be great for me as well, easy to run and last a long time. If I'm a resident community, and that's different to a resident, I want to live in a place where I get to know my neighbours and the building helps me to do that. And if I'm the resident themselves, sometimes they're thought of as the most important person for housing. They are, but they're only one of these 5 communities, I would suggest. And you want it to be affordable, and you want to just really, really enjoy living in your home. So I want you to now pretend that you're a public sector commissioner. Fantastic. It feels really good. You can borrow money cheaply, and you've got a massive land bank. What's not to like? And you've also probably got a ready-made housing management service, so we're in business here. But there's some black clouds floating in. You've got a land bank, but you've got a duty to get the highest price you can for that land, and we can talk about that because that's a very boring but important point. You can't even sell your land to yourself for nothing. You can't do it in this country. And then borrowing. Some of your members, quite rightly, might not want to borrow up to the hilt, because it does go wrong, especially if you're building private homes. So we've got some debt caps and we've got some risk aversion. So into the land of I'm a public sector client floats these black clouds. Right. So whose help do you need? You need builders and you need a design team. That's what you don't have at the council. And you might need some sales expertise as well. And guess what? You can get that in one package, and it's called a developer. And that's incredibly tempting. And I'll come back to why a lot of authorities just go for that. But here we go. What are your pressures? And councils, you might have noticed, are under a lot of strain. You've got your politicians going, I want it now, absolutely now. And interestingly, they can lead the better stuff because they really want an attractive legacy. They don't want to be the politician that built that crap under their watch. But then you've got a property team at the council. They want to max out the land value. I've seen a number of authorities in London going, higher, higher, more, I want £60 million for that land. And they are a very powerful customer within the local authority. You've also got the housing team going, I want the most affordable homes possible, please. And those two things are now working against each other. You've got the finance team going, listen, we can't even look after old people. Why are we borrowing and doing all this stuff to do housing on our own? So they want to deaden the initial capital cost of what you're doing, and they want to max out the long-term income. So they want no affordable homes. They want it all to be PRS. And then the legal team going, I'm really frightened of procurement. Please don't do anything weird because we'll get into trouble with lawyers and all sorts of people and we'll be JR'd. So don't pick those strange architects that we don't understand. So that is what you will face as a council person. I'm taking too long, sorry. Right. So the public sector can't do it all. So they're procuring developers. What do? They get that land payment up. It leads to low build costs. So the more that developers having to pay for the land, the less they're going to spend on the homes. And that is pretty simple, really. Also, the financial model, if you're doing a load of homes, like they are in many councils at the minute, you need a lot of upfront infrastructure. And what that means is people tend to get married to one developer, and that, as we've seen very recently, is a real difficulty. And there's very weak quality metrics used when local authorities try and procure developers. When they procure architects, you can read my ranty article about that. The fee often overbalances the scoring. I'm sure Russell will talk about this more than I will. You're measured on whether you've got good BIM skills, design's seen as risky and expensive. And frankly, local authorities, unless they're really enlightened, think that you're all really frightening and you're going to design weird things and that you don't understand contractors, and I'll come back to that. Thank you. So here's how you do, I'm going to do one more minute. Here's how you procure developers. You ask them for all this stuff. And also, in Europe, they set the land value. They tell the developer what the land value is, and then they say, what's your quality offer? Architects, it's easy. We all know how people should procure architects. It's not about their fee. It's about, are they great at residence design and adding value? And actually, you should be able to just set the architect's fee as well. So local authorities at this point would say, but it's all really scary and it's all going to go wrong. This building was designed by a 5-person practice. It was built by a massive national house builder. That should have gone horribly wrong. And guess what? It didn't. So final slide, turning the tank around. I'm going to just read very quickly from this. Yes, you've got to understand the pressures and drivers of your clients, but also we have to train and promote fantastic leaders that believe in this stuff and are going to take risks and remind them of their long-term duties. Promote what architects can do, yes, but make sure you understand construction and cost, please, because that will help your cause. And campaign to change the culture of what housing should be and do for our society, and boringly change the land valuation model and the interpretation of OG rules, and then we're in business. Thank you.
Fantastic, thank you, Claire. And those who came to last year's fundamentals will remember that the conclusion was that we're all going to go and work in the public sector. So it's a perfect lesson for you there. Next up, we have Russell Curtis, who was a founding director of RCKa Architects, which was twice finalist for Young Architect of the Year award. He's a founder of Project Compass, a not-for-profit research organisation that campaigns for better procurement of public buildings. Russell's a member of the LLDC Quality Review Panel, and there's some members of the LLDC lurking in the audience, Croydon's Place Review Panel, and a Mayor's Design Advocate. Over to Russell.
Thanks, Ollie. So many people here to look at my graphs. It's incredible. Okay, I want to start with some examples. This is a competition. This is the fundamental issues with procurement. This is a competition that was announced, the shortlist was announced this week or last week. 120 entries, 39 shortlisted for a £1 million project. At the same time, in Barnet, where I live, just around the corner, this is a new leisure centre that's being commissioned by Capita. Absolutely no scrutiny over the procurement process. They're actually doing 2 of these, multi-million-pound leisure centre, no scrutiny, no shortlist, nothing. This stuff just gets built, and it'll probably look like that terrible SketchUp drawing just there. A fundamental issue about to procurement is that if we think about the cost of a building, let's say it's £1 million or something, typically the design cost is something like 10%. Something like 10%. During its life, or the cost of maintenance during its lifetime, let's say it's a 25-year lifetime, 5 times the original cost of the building. The cost of that building in use to the client, obviously this depends on what type of building it is, typically somewhere between 50 and 200 times. Now, if you look at a 10% uplift in the, let's say a 10% uplift in the architect's fee, and then a 10% uplift in the sort of the size of the lifetime cost of the building, you know, this is what we focus all our time, that little orange dot there, that's what we're obsessed about. The rest of this, nobody cares about. It seems to be of such little importance to a lot of public sector clients. This is the fundamental truth, or the fundamental thing that we have to get over. This has led to a whole profession around procurement. There is actually a chartered Institute of Procurement and Supply. This is a statement from their website, from their construction section. Just to highlight the key phrase. You might want to just drink in this phrase at the bottom here. You know, this is what it's all about. They're proud of the fact that they've got Carillion working with them. So make of that what you will. Now, we've ended up in a situation in this country where somehow we procure more through OJEU than 24 other nations across Europe combined. We have the most procurement by OJEU of any other country. Yet, it's 20% more expensive than comparable EU countries. And also, come on, it is the slowest, one of the slowest in Europe. We're beaten by Greece and Malta, but you know, apart from that, we are one of the slowest. I mean, it's astonishing. So what we've managed to achieve is a system that's slower, more expensive, more wasteful, and we have a whole profession that's managed to do this for us. Where are we? But I think something important to get across, that OJEU is not our enemy. And I hear this stuff about OJEU being criticised all the time. Actually, OJEU does a lot of really good things. It's a catchy title in the UK is the Public Contract Regulations 2015. That's what it's called in the UK. But there's a lot of stuff in there that sort of discourages aggregation. This is the sort of packaging of lots of small contracts into large contracts, and this is specifically discouraged in OJEU. It's also, am I pressing these buttons? There we go. It also restricts turnover requirements. You cannot ask for excessive turnover requirements as part of an OJEU process. And it also allows for innovative and less wasteful forms of procurement. Sadly, very few of which we use in this country. And it does make this provision for design contests, which is pretty unique to the construction industry. So I'm going to talk about OJEU design contests in a second. So within design contests, this is a formal process within OJEU. It requires anonymous judging at some point during that process, and the jury must comprise 1/3 architects, and there can't be any discriminatory conclusion. So what this has led to is a profile of design contests across Europe. Looks something like this. In France, in 2017, they had 867 OJEU design contests. In Germany, 216. Italy, 49. 2 in the UK. Now this is, you know, they managed more in Liechtenstein than we managed. I mean, it's, you know, Liechtenstein has something like, you know, a 50th of the economy of the UK. It's mind-boggling. Now, it's very easy for me at this point to criticise Malcolm Redick, so that's exactly what I'm going to do. Helsinki, and this, to be fair, this is a product of the fact that we have so few design contests in this country. So what happens is a really enticing project comes up through a fully OJU compliant process, and of course everybody enters it. So we end up with, you know, in this case it was an open, anonymous, two-stage OJU design contest. Great form of procurement. 130 million euro project, fantastic. They had 1,715 submissions. And we reckon that, let's have a conservative estimate of how much it costs per practice. Let's say it's between 5,000 and 10,000 euros per practice. That's a total cost to the industry of somewhere between 15 and 20 million euros, which is, as you can see, quite a high proportion of the total cost of the building. Nearly there. So is there another way? Well, there is. We're working with an organisation called RCKa in the Netherlands. They run OJU-compliant design contests. Their first stage submission is a 2-page written submission, text only, what is your approach to the project, and then 2 A3 pages of reference images. No design. You are specifically excluded if you include design. It can only be similar projects that you think are applicable to this particular scheme. So that's one example. So that's the first stage, and that's all anonymous, judged anonymous. The second stage is they judge these, draw a shortlist of around 5 projects. Each of those shortlisted schemes gets a 10,000 euro honorarium. And this is one of the recent commissions that RCKa has been working on. And this has resulted, this is for a hospital, undertaken this way, and they've ended up with this great project, which I think it took 3 months, cost about 30,000 euros to procure, and it's now going ahead. So I think, you know, if we can learn something from that, then that would be a great opportunity. There we go. Sorry, more than 5 minutes, but that's it.
Excellent. Thank you, Russell. Some good lessons from the Dutch there. I should put a shout out for the Belgians as well, because I noticed Ellis Woodman is here. The Flemish have a very good open op-prep system, which, yeah, maybe similar to the Dutch model. Next up, we have Hughes from Khaa, a company that specializes in stakeholder engagement, design briefing, and team selection processes. Khaa worked as an architect for 10 years before transferring to the public sector to work with Sport England on the Manchester Commonwealth Games, as a client for the Foreign and Commonwealth Office, and then as head of design for London 2012 Olympics. And I should mention that she was part of a 6-woman strong team that won the National Infrastructure Commission competition just before Christmas for the Oxford-Cambridge corridor. So over to Khaa.
I'm afraid I don't have any slides. I'm going to give you a slightly more personal perspective. I've been kind of around the client industry, I suppose, for a fair while. And I wanted to put a little bit of the procurement in context. So in 2002, when I ran a competition for the Warsaw Embassy in Poland, I actually sat down at a computer and I wrote my own OJU notice. And I spoke to a lawyer for about an hour on the phone, and we talked about what process we might do, and we'll do that one. And I sent it off, and it goes straight to Belgium or the EU somewhere. It came back, and then we sent out and we asked for submissions. And strangely enough, looking at your slides, the submissions were very small. They asked for 3 examples of similar style work. We didn't ask for anybody to have designed an embassy before, because none of them would have. And from that, we selected a group, and they carried out a competition. And they were paid, it was in 2002, an honorarium of £10,000. So what I kind of wanted to say, you know, it was short and it was tailored to the architects, because we knew that they would submit a paper brochure. So then sort of fast forward to sort of 2006, joining the Olympics, you know, big project, and, you know, except things might be different. But the bureaucracy around choosing a design team had sort of ricocheted kind of out of control. So we had an independent procurement team who sat in another part of the building and just did procurement. They were worried about the risk. They had a whole series of questions, and then that was overlaid as well with a whole series of additional supplementary requirements which were coming in at the time, which have some good outcomes, so quality statements and a whole series of other things that the teams had to put in when they wanted to come in. And then that also suddenly included putting submissions in online, because that was another government initiative. So I remember talking to one architect who'd spent 5 days trying to get his submission through the portal because it didn't work very well, because it was a great idea for the government, but it didn't actually work very well. So I actually spent quite a lot of my time there sort of toning down requirements, closing procurement people out of rooms, and then also because they let these very big contracts, as Russell said, you can put in requirements for those. So I put short design team selection processes into big contracts for electricity. So we managed to appoint Nord as, who'd been the Young Architect of the year before, in that contract, because I put a little process into the contract really early on, and we did that with a whole myriad of different projects because it was the only way to get them in. So what I wanted to say is, where did all of this procurement come from? Because I think for me that's quite interesting. And I think that in the late 90s, there was a lot of lobbying of government by very big organisations, and I did actually manage to get into the room once where they had Tesco's and all the big people sitting in the room saying, well, you want to do it this way. And it was in early days of kind of Labour government were coming in, and they were willing to take all of this advice. And of course, they were also keen to reduce costs, so they thought bigger procurement would be cheaper. Then the other thing was bringing in PFI. And because PFI brings in private equity and it brings in debt, it also brings in a lot of legal agreements really early on. And that puts a huge amount of pressure on what you need to have in terms of information from all of the people submitting. It makes things very risk adverse. And that has transferred over to the public sector. So I've got 4 main points to make about the industry. That this new cadre of procurement professionals, they're not experts in the field that they're procuring, but they have grown significantly. And I don't think that that industry is going to go away. So we've got to accept it's going to stay in some form or another. I think there's a lack of public sector skills. So I'm sure anyone who's a professional is used to being asked really stupid questions and then having to give really long, stupid answers to things they don't really understand because it's in the procurement submission. And then it's also becoming increasingly kind of legalistic because the cost of putting a bid in is getting higher and higher all the time. So whereas you might do a short process and everyone will go, oh, fine, it's great, so-and-so won, nowadays they're much more willing to contest it. So it's actually making itself more risk-averse than it used to be. And then finally, I think the big point that I think we as an industry need to make is the transaction costs around this as a whole, because my soundings indicate that the industry, and you've said it, I've been hearing between 10 and 30%, but it depends on the scale of the practice. If you're a small practice, it's a bigger proportion of the margins. And so for me, the argument is an economic one that needs to be made to government about the industry being slowed down and the traction on the industry. So I'll just finish off then. So this drag on the economy comes not only from architects bidding, it comes from the cost of the architect's team or the procurement team. Sometimes, quite often now, there's a legal team, so they're probably paid more than the architects who are actually bidding. And then the cost of time and the resources of the client actually going through and assessing all of that. So it's a huge amount. It's not just in our industry, it's in all of those industries. And then finally, whether actually the people who are asking the questions are really capable of answering, looking at the responses and assessing them, because I think very often they're not. So what would I improve? So I'd quite like to see something like a benchmarking study across the industry, which obviously Project Compass are already doing, to look at what the percentage loss to the industry is, I think in a post-Brexit world, which I kind of hate to say, but we could roll back thresholds on ODU. We could make them much higher than they are now and go back to kind of ideas around just a few people tendering for smaller projects. And I think a refocus on procurement where PQQ goes back to being 80% about the skills that you're acquiring and only 20% about sort of marginal things like, you know, are there 5 people in the practice? So, you know, every time I hear on the radio these days, Britain's not performing, Britain is underperforming, we're not productive, I always think about procurement because I think that's where we're really kind of make our own worst enemy. Thank you.
Fantastic. Bit of post-Brexit optimism, dare I say. We are going to hear from Malcolm Redick, who is the founder of Malcolm Redick Consultants, which I think is the world's leading organizer of architectural competitions, having coordinated everything from the Guggenheim Helsinki, as we've heard already, to London's new Holocaust Memorial Project and the V&A Exhibition Road extension, amongst many others. Malcolm trained as an architect originally and is a trustee of English Heritage and was previously design director at the British Council. So over to you, Malcolm.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the build-up. Okay, my passion is competitions. That's what I'm going to talk about. Do they get a bad press? In the UK, sadly, yes, you've heard some examples of that from the other speakers as well. But it's because many are perceived as badly run, fixed, or just plain unfair. Architects blame the clients blame the architects. In my experience, clients actually do want good design outcomes. They don't sort of embark upon this for other reasons. They start off enthusiastically, but they're faced with a daunting investment and a lack of skills to help them. There's a willingness to seek great design, but this is compromised by the internal pressures of easy access to unimaginative procurement advisors and project managers, and we've heard about that this evening. I'm going to generalize, but how many clients are experts? Very few, particularly in the public sector. It's something they do once, maybe twice, but they're not repeat clients like commercial clients. So what are the benefits? The first and obvious point, what are the benefits for entering competitions for architects? The first and obvious point is getting noticed. Shortlists ensure visibility, and many architects tell us that appearing on one of the shortlists of the competitions that we run dramatically increases their inquiries. And we've even seen a client pick somebody for another project from an introduction that we've made through a shortlist. So it offers the architects a chance to show real appetite and connection with a client's project. And the other benefit is obviously winning. Winning a competition is still the gold standard for architects. It's a warranty of excellence and of exceeding your peers, and it has the potential to catapult the firm to the next level. And there's some very good examples of this, of emerging architects who are now very established. And Alvar Aalto, who, that great modernist, entered over 100 competitions, but only to see a handful actually built. And he said prophetically that winning a competition does not always guarantee a commission. So he entered 104 competitions. He won about 50, just over 50. 25 of these were cancelled before design commenced. Another 12 failed to complete after design had been carried out, which left a grand total of just into double digits of projects that were built that he'd entered as competitions. But he never lost the drive to compete. And he treated every single competition as a potential winner and structured his company around that. He made it a central part of working for the studio. And some of you will have noticed that the slides are not actually directly related to what I'm saying, but they're really a prompt to show the diversity of design and designers that's possible to get through competitions. These are examples from our portfolio. So what about outside the UK? Well, judging from the interest we get from clients outside the UK, there's a far better understanding abroad of the value of competitions. The investment is not seen as a cost, which it is here, and not a cost to the project, but a way of improving outcomes, reducing risk, and creating a powerful narrative around a project. Competitions start at the beginning of projects, so it creates a story in itself. And we've all heard stories about how young architects get established winning competitions in Switzerland, Finland, and Germany. And I have to say, and Russell's slides were pretty excellent about this, that we seem to follow the rules. Somehow, we accept all the rules in this country, whereas other countries find loopholes and innovative ways to introduce procurement to encourage emerging practices. So what is the best recipe? I've seen and lived the whole life cycle of projects, from design all the way through to construction. And I'm very devoted to competitions as finding a great way of promoting innovation and bringing on new talent. So just a quick example, Field and Fowles won a competition we ran for Homerton College in Cambridge. Their total engagement in the process and their commitment to craftsmanship absolutely won over the client from a very strong shortlist. Amanda Levitt's Virtuoso scheme for the V&A trumped a shortlist of international talent, and she won that competition at a very early stage of the practice. But it's a beautiful, challenging, magical addition to a national museum. So all of these competitions were run, and the competitions we run are all run to OJU guidelines or institutional guidelines, so many for public clients and institutions. But the other side of the coin, I think, is developing, and this certainly I've seen it in the last year in the UK, as an increasing trend by clients to badge tenders as international design competitions, hoping perhaps to give them some glamour and stardust. And architects, understandably keen to impress and irrepressible optimists, I'm an architect myself, believe that the Trojan effort of entering a competition will make things okay, will persuade the client. But they're in denial about the increasing evidence of one-sided copyright terms, of handing over all your copyright for a small payment, up to 50% of weighting going to financial side fees, and then the lack of decent honoraria for entering. So I just have 5 conclusions, 5 principles, having experienced this process around the world. We've run about 85 competitions. We've been doing it for about 20 years, all the way from a £2 million cafe in Kings Road, all the way up to a 1 million square foot art gallery. Great. I've got the 5 principles are: competitions should have transparency from beginning to end. No surprises, no changes to terms. All published at the beginning of the process so everybody knows what is expected of them. There's an explanation of the post-complete competition process, so everybody's clear about the risks of entering competition. Is it funded? How is the design going to contribute to that? There are many particularly cultural projects where the design is actually part of persuading funders to give money. Some form of reward, such a prize, honorarium, publication, so it's very clear what you're getting. And then clarity on evaluation of the submissions. Right at the start, it should be very clear how the submissions are going to be treated and how the jury is going to score them, and then making a commitment to give architects feedback about those scores. And the final point is a proper brief with defined outcomes. When we work for clients, I would say half of the time we spend before the competition is launched is helping to write the brief and pulling this together. And we think it's an absolutely fundamental part. So if you see a competition with a very bad brief, please forget it. Thank you very much for listening to me.
Great. Well, could I please ask our 4 panelists to join me on the sofas? So I'm just going to kick off with a couple of questions before opening it up. Russell, I thought one of your slides was the most depressing, given that in the UK we have the slowest, most expensive, and yet kind of least number of these kinds of competitions. Could I ask the panel, just one at a time, to say the one thing you would introduce to try and make procurement in the UK more efficient and more geared towards higher quality? If you were king or queen of procurement for a day, what one regulation would you introduce?
Well, I have a suggestion. I mean, actually, and Malcolm's an interesting example of this. actually what we need is more architects as commissioners. In Europe, it's quite common for architects to take on a role helping to define a good brief, as a client advisor. So these bodies which don't necessarily have experience in running procurement of any sort, can call on an architect, and come in, and that architect can guide them through the process. And so more architects as commissioners or supporting commissioning would make a huge difference.
Oh God, it sounds really lame, but I'd say the same thing. It just seems to me you need an interlocutor between, that kind of hard side and the budget and all of those things, and the design profession that needs support in being able to understand what's required. And that kind of, that stage of writing the brief and helping, the client understand what they want, and then supporting and providing that for the architects so they can respond appropriately. It's a really important role.
You can pitch for your consultancy as well.
But I mean, increasingly I meet architects who have clients who are in public bodies who have no understanding of architecture, are quite young because they're not paid very much, and so are constantly asking them things that they are kind of a bit irrelevant, really. They're just scared.
Malcolm, apart from more competitions.
I think one of the things, which is probably a minor thing, but it would help hugely, I think, is stripping out from the procurement process these crazy requirements for things like turnover and insurance, and the whole interpretation of what relevant experience is. And I think, when we've run competitions in the past, we're very careful to define relevant experience is not the fact, if it's a library, you've built 7 libraries. It's really what are the factors about the brief that might make your experience and approach relevant to this project. And so I think it's probably a redefining of terms and stripping out these rather bizarre and totally unnecessary barriers to particularly younger practices entering the process.
Claire?
I guess I'm just thinking about local authorities procuring developers with architects in tow, and so that removes the architect from the local authority's gaze, if you like. And if that's what happens, and it will happen forever, then an enlightened authority will ask the developer who's designing this building, and you'd want it, if it's a big project, to be multiple people, and then you'd say to them, and how are you going to achieve what I call design resilience? So how is the idea not only going to get through planning, but get built as well? And actually, if you pick developers on that basis and that they have to explain the process by which the design will be continued through, I think that would be a great metric. The second aspect of local authorities, and I've said it already, is that land price in Europe, they set it. So I'm in Stockholm and I say, I've got 25 pieces of land and I'm going to parcel them all out, and I'm going to say that one's worth 12 million euro. I've set that. I know I want 12 million euro back because I've done all sorts of things to that land. And so now I want 4 developers to come to me with a fantastic quality offer, and I want them to max out the affordable and max out the design, and I'll judge them on that alone. And there are various boring rules here which just mean that thou shalt not set the land price. And I think that is a killer to large-scale housing procurement in the UK.
My next question is about self-initiated projects, which then end up requiring public funds. So there's been a very high-profile bridge in the news with some trees on it, which was a kind of private group's idea, which is fine, and then it becomes a publicly funded project. There's another example of a very useful bridge in Rotherhithe, which some architects came up with themselves. It's gone through a much more kind of thorough TfL-led procurement process, and now those architects have found they're not eligible to enter this open procurement process. So I just wanted to ask you how, in the case of a self-initiated thing, surely we are, as architects, we should be entrepreneurial and spearheading these ideas, not waiting for clients to commission us. If a project like that ends up using public money, how can you ensure that the procurement process is fair and above board? without stealing the originator's idea? Russell.
Well, it's an incredibly tricky one, and I'm not sure I know the answer. I think that what's happened, and we're talking about the I think obviously the Heatherwick Bridge and then the Reform and Elliott Wood cycle bridge at Rotherhithe. What's happened there is that TfL has got it very badly wrong on Garden Bridge, and then on Rotherhithe sort of reacted and gone far too far the other way, and excluded a really good idea. I think fundamentally what needs to happen is it should be about the idea and what is the output of this project. Now, with the Garden Bridge, I think. Without getting too much detail, there was a questionable need for a bridge in that location, okay? But it was a nice idea, it was sort of iconic thing to do. The Rotherhithe Bridge fundamentally needs a cycle bridge in that location, so there is a genuine public need for it. And so what should happen is, it should be possible for organisations to come up, like architects, to come up with ideas and promote those, and then get a fair crack at the whip, But I don't think it's responsible to be saying, well, you come up with a great idea, here's 40 million quid, here's the cash. I mean, there has to be some middle ground, which I think is, we need to find. I'm not quite sure what that is, but it must be there somewhere.
I think don't use public money, just do it differently.
Crowdfund.
Yeah.
Yeah. But I would also just say that. The fact that they were doing that meant that they had huge contacts with all of those people, and therefore that does put it out of the range of any other architects doing that job. So although procurement has become way too bureaucratic, at the end of the day it does stop people giving jobs to their mates, and I think that falls into that category, frankly.
Yeah. Malcolm.
I don't have anything to add. I think Russell's point is very good, but there must be some way of being able to push these things out. And at some point, the people who are in charge do understand that has to go through some sort of procurement process.
Well, there are mechanisms. I mean, there are mechanisms in place. Even with OJU, there are procedures within OJU that allow this stuff to happen. It's just that we're not very good at using them.
Yeah, that segues beautifully onto my next question, which is about OJU and Brexit. Are there potential opportunities? The Architects Journal recently described OJU as a dreaded bureaucratic minefield which should be avoided at all costs. It is wasteful, anti-risk, frustratingly slow, and off-limits to all but a handful of companies. Would you agree with that statement?
It's all baked into our law.
Yeah.
It's game over.
Yeah.
Really.
There's no alternative?
No.
I think, the problem is, and I think I touched on this in my slide, I think the problem is that, there is a system, that is OJU, and we've transposed that into our national legislation. But actually, it's so vague. It's so vague. What we've done is that we've gold-plated everything. So as Malcolm said earlier, all of the sort of optional bits, all the, well, you can do this if you want, we've taken all that and made it mandatory. And my worry is that, in the sunlit uplands of Brexit, when we've abandoned OJU, what's going to replace it? We have this sort of, this approach in the UK, which is about making everything really, really complicated. And is it not just going to get more and more complicated without OJU sort of in the background trying to resist that happening?
Yeah, I mean, I would say that the reason it becomes very bureaucratic here is because of our legal process, which is adversarial, whereas in Europe they have a Napoleonic-based legal process. So they set the rules and then they follow them. So, that's...
Good answer.
That's a big improvement. But actually, there are... I don't believe the system can't change because, we do as a nation need to look at how much we spend doing things, and it's very wasteful of time, effort, emotion to keep producing stuff that doesn't actually have any effect. And I think the industry saying, look, we are spending way too much following bureaucratic processes which we have no control of and that you don't really need, would be a really good step to doing that.
Yeah, the laws are fine. It's the interpretation we make of them here that's problematic. And maybe there's a kind of European leadership training, which is get a load of public sector people to go and look at some fantastic projects and then have it explained to them how they were done and then say, and what happened? Nobody got sued, you know. But as you say, the legal systems are different, so it's very difficult to translate some stuff from there to here.
Malcolm, what's your take on OJU?
I think it's, I mean, we're sort of talking really about kind of a narrow definition of OJU because of, you know, we're all interested in the procurement of architectural services. And this is not a pitch, but you've got 4 people on the panel who've all achieved OJU processes which have been successful. The people who've entered them have been happy, and they haven't had a challenge. And you know, it's not impossible to run OJU processes in that way, but it does require a bit of creativity in deciding, in focusing on what the main issues are. It is only a system of process. I think the AJ's point is really sort of trying to generate a story, but actually at its root, it is simply a process which needs to be followed. Yes, it has a lot of things which are wrong with it, and it requires sometimes an effort to understand why you've been asked to fill in things. But there are changes which we've taken, and I think this self-certification now of PQQs means you don't have to spend a hell of a long time filling out your PQQs, and there are indications that this will change. But I think the point that was made, that the fact that we're leaving the EU does not mean that this procurement process is suddenly going to change in whenever it is 2 years' time. It will be with us for a very long time.
Just moving it slightly away from procurement to I suppose the processes, you know, to which, you know, the title of tonight's debate was build. The fact that so often architects are hired cynically to win planning and then dropped as soon as possible by the client for a cheaper alternative. You know, and then projects led by contractors, whether it's a design and build contract with the architect novated or kept on the client side. I mean, could you just comment on the state of, I suppose, you know, construction contracts and what could be done, you know, if things are too contractor dominated, if they are too risk averse, or if we're happy with the current system? How can architects have more agency in these processes? As an architect,
I get the feeling that actually things are changing. I think the idea that, you know, that the contractor is the person you should go to to effectively procure a building, which is what we're doing really. I mean, you're absolutely right. Not all the time, but a lot of the time, you'll hire an architect to design something, get planning for it, and then either they'll be novated and they're working entirely for the contractor, or they'll just be ditched entirely and somebody else will come on who knows nothing about the scheme to implement it. And I think that there is this realisation suddenly that really isn't a very sensible way of doing things, that it's not really delivering cost certainty, it's certainly not delivering quality. And I get the sense that a lot of the more sort of sophisticated public clients are realising that actually, you know, this is not the right way to do things. And I get a sense that there's a gradual change occurring.
Does everyone share Russell's optimism? No, Claire.
Well, yes and no. I think, weirdly, some clients are going back to traditional procurement now, where the architect draws every doorknob and the contractor prices it. And that's a really interesting development. So I don't think you're entirely wrong. But I think there is a massive problem still between the construction industry and architects. I think they've become split apart, and they learn to hate each other very early on, probably now for a lot of people in the room. And I think it has to come back together. Contractors have got to think that you're adding value and you're adding something fantastic to it, and that you're not bonkers. And I know a lot of contractors who think that, you know, you're all bonkers and that you're adding a lot of cost and no value. So that's contractors and developers. But I've seen it work where those constructors and developers have actually seen what architects can do, but there's an entente that has to happen, whether from the construction side too. So both parties have to understand each other's motivations, drivers, and technical issues. And I think there's much more of that ought to happen during the education process.
Okay.
I just think it plays a little bit into our planning process, because the reason that architects are appointed to get planning is because that's where the most value is made out of a site. And so the argument is, if you've got a really nice design, then you might be able to go up an extra 2 stories and you get a bigger profit on your bottom line. And so For me, the root of that is in our planning system, which is about people bidding on a site and paying a certain amount for it, and often overbidding, which I think would be helped by having more kind of master plans that say, these are the parameters for the site, this is how big it will be, and it kind of goes back a little bit to what you're saying, because, say, for example, in Holland, the municipality do the urban plan, they hand out the urban plan, everybody knows how tall the building is, how wide it is, and then the developers and the architects put the bid in together. And so it does two things. It gives everybody a little bit of certainty on what they're going to deliver, but it also takes out this kind of creaming the system, opportunity cost that's being lost out of housing.
But fundamentally it's about risk, isn't it? Because what happens is the reason that clients like design and build is because they can just delegate the risk to a contractor, whereas if in a planning system where you kind of know what you know what you can build, the size of the thing you can build, there is far less risk in it. So there's no need to then sort of delegate this down the chain.
But it has become really cultural. I mean, I think the whole thing with PFI was, this is it. We've got this project and we're going to hand you all the risk. We'd just like you to do this for us. Design and build was the start of it. PFI was the second one, and it was this inability for people to take responsibility for what they're doing.
And do you think that is changing? I mean, Malcolm, with the projects you're running, are you trying to...
Well, yeah, I suppose I'm from a generation, I can remember the disengagement of architects from society, which happened in the sort of 70s, 80s and 90s, and the rise of the project manager and the whole sort of nature of the client's relationship with the designer changing. But I do see a bit more light at the end of the tunnel. And we've noticed it, certainly for the competitions that we've put together. Say 10 years ago, running an architectural competition, it would be for an architect. And it was a fairly straightforward process. Now, most of our competitions, any of you know them, are really for collaborative teams. And they can be, up to 6 or 7 different skill sets coming together. There's a blurring of skill sets and a blurring of what architects call themselves, and it's terrific to see a lot of practices where it's a real mix-up. It's not just architects, but it's engineers, and it's...
And then are you seeing the weighting change in the sense that less is placed on the quality of the design?
Well, I was going to say, I think what happens is there's a more integrated design. So I think this whole sense of what the design issue is, it's no longer just an architectural issue. There are other components which are contributing to the success of that broad design. And I see that is something which is really encouraging, fantastic to see. And I think clients are, certainly the clients that we have, are responding to it very much.
Just before I open it up to questions, finally, in terms of international precedents where we can learn from, we've already seen a Dutch example, and you mentioned the French have many more competitions. Which other countries have got it right, and how can we adopt their methods?
Well, the classic is Finland, because there they have they set out architectural competition principles 150 years ago. That's how early this was defined. And the entire profession promotes talent coming through. So there's always a place on the short list for an emerging practice. It's a rite of passage for architects in Finland. If you enter a competition in Finland, you pretty well have to be a Finnish architect. It's almost impossible to enter if you're not. It's really part of the whole studio process. Entering competitions is seen as the way to commission buildings in Finland. So maybe Finland has a great example.
But I mean, there's some examples in Netherlands where, similar to the one I showed earlier, where these procurements, you have a sort of a PQQ process that we're familiar with, but they'll also stick in a wild card. They'll stick in a random young practice, just to make sure that the things that are coming through are of sufficient quality. So everybody knows they're going to have to up their game if they're up against a design-led young practice, rather than just churning out the same thing. If all you're doing is competing on turnover or insurance. Or
does the wild card ever win, or they're just being used for novelty value?
No, sometimes it does. Sometimes it does. Yeah. But they're far better at judging these things on the basis of quality than they are of price and stuff like that.
Okay.
I just think it's slightly, if you do get yourself into the position of being in that public sector, it's beholden on you to push those thresholds down, make sure they're as low as they possibly can be, change the turnover things. If you're running a competition, I really hope that you get as much of that out of the way as you possibly can, so that you get those young teams in there, because I think it's true.
Claire, you did a kind of European tour, didn't you, when you left Peabody? Which country were you most impressed by?
All of them. I agree. Finland's great. Sweden, Austria. Those are the key ones where they just seem to be doing a lot of things right. Interestingly, though, in Helsinki, they were building a lot of housing at high speed, and some of it was pretty terrible. So, you've got to be careful what you wish for.
Okay, I think we have roving microphones in the audience, and the first hand is up. So we're going to begin there. And then...
Hello, my question's for Claire, or the panel as well, but you said something early on about how it takes a bit of guts for a council not to get in bed with the developer because they just provide the whole package. How can we make it more alluring for councils not to always choose that option?
I think the answer is in big upfront slug of money from the government. And interestingly, they've got more money now. Very interestingly, they've been given with their new housing remit, the Moho Locogo, or whatever that department's now called, have been given money to effectively de-risk sites a bit and buy things and amalgamate things. And once you've done that, you don't need to say to the developer partners, we need 80 million up front to just put in the pipes, wires, roads, buy things, take all that difficult. Once you've taken that risk out and you've just got some government borrowing, or you've got a particular way of doing that initial bit, you can then go to individual parties. I mean, I've always thought it's bonkers, this one developer thing, and having seen it again on the continent, you want your Pegasus Life or you want your specialist person to come and do the fantastic older people's housing. You don't want one spec house builder trying to do everything. Actually, they don't kind of want to do it either. They don't understand how to do all those really interesting bits of co-housing and whatever. Leave that to the people that want to do it, and the authority itself in some places wanting to do it, and just get specialists. I mean, Hammarby's the really famous one that everyone's probably heard of in Stockholm, where they had 25 developers and 40 architects on that site, and that just puts the fear of God into local authorities here. But actually, it can be done, and it is possible, and it doesn't create some crazy zoo or management problem. So how do we achieve that? I think it is through this upfront funding, and I think that might, hopefully, come through. Because the reason local authorities go to one person is that one person says, if I'm going to spend 100 million now, it's going to take me all that time and all those sites to get my money back.
We've got the next question in the front row. There are two microphones. This one. Yeah. Oh. And then someone.
Thank you. Thanks, and very pleased to hear procurement being talked about in an architecture school. Finn Williams from Public Practice, because I do think if only a small proportion of the talent, the design talent and intelligence invested in entering these competitions was put sort of earlier upstream in writing the briefs and working on the procurement processes, we'd have a lot better built environment. My question is really picking up on the point of scale and risk that's already come up. So my experience of public procurement is this law of nature, this inevitable tendency to end up putting all your eggs in one basket, to go with the one biggest contract which seems to be safest because they've got the biggest turnover. And yet, as we've seen with procurement, with Carillion, if that basket drops, all the eggs are broken in one go. So I just wondered, what is it going to take for the public sector to shift their attitude on risk, to see spreading their bets with lots of small players as actually a safer option, a less risky option than going with these very big parties.
Is Carillion the watershed? I mean, has it happened?
Well, I hate to say it, but that would probably help more of these dramatic failures, but nobody wants that. But I think there is it's curious really, because the government has targets for involving small and medium enterprises and micro enterprises in procurement contracts. And it amazes me that you have procurement things like HS2, the 4 stations, which are going to be, the biggest piece of infrastructure, certainly in this side of the middle of the century. And the Commission has gone to sort of 2 architects, or it's a round robin of architects. And there's absolutely nothing to say against the pedigree of Grimshaw and Wilkinson Eyre, but you would have thought that they could have found some way of introducing some diversity to the mix. And so that is an absolute mystery, how these things are allowed to happen and are not challenged more by us all. Because after all, that's our legacy. We will get those stations.
But not only that, they've done it as a relay. So, for example,
that's
Houston, it's been one architect chucking the baby over to someone else.
The HS2 procurement setup, could you just explain what that means? So, they've done it as a relay.
Well, they've done it as a relay. So they've had Arup working on the project for many years, and then with Grimshaw. And then the last iteration of the design was with Wilkinson Eyre, and now they've re-tendered it again, and it's gone back to Grimshaw's. So actually there's no continuity from stage to stage on that design, let alone getting it to planning.
How has that been allowed to happen? I mean, given we have this National Infrastructure Commission, Sadie Morgan sits on to ensure design quality and better procurement, and they're trying their best. What's gone wrong in the case of HS2? If you guys were in charge, what would you have done differently?
I think those decisions are made so early on that it needs somebody in there right at the very outset, because otherwise you can't control them. Once that kind of train starts moving with the process, everyone buys into the process, and all the people working on the project going, that's the next milestone, that's what we've got to achieve. So it's got to happen right at the very beginning.
I think it may be the inappropriate application of some of these thresholds. I'm not party to it, so I don't know. But we did a project for a very large public sector client, and the sort of opening gambit was that they wanted to encourage small and emerging practices. And so we thought, fantastic, and the conversation went on. And then, I think it was even the same day, the threshold turnover should be £50 million per annum of fees. And you thought, well, is this, have I misheard something, or is there something kind of curious going on? But I think, a number of the speakers have said it today. It's really, there's a mismatch between the ambitions that clients have, who genuinely, I think, do want to see design quality, and the advisors that they have, who come from legal and procurement point of view, who impose these bizarre requirements, which are apparently never challenged. So people don't say, well, why do you need a £50 million turnover? And that, I think, that mismatch is going to carry on compounding the problem that there is in public sector procurement.
Could I go back to Finn's question?
Yes, yeah, sorry.
Because how do you get away from going to one big developer? I think it's actually by setting a framework so that you can portion those pieces out into smaller parts, and then making the argument that if you give it to somebody who really cares about it and really wants to do it, that actually you have much less risk than you do putting it to a big procurer who's probably not managing things all the time and is slack and can get lazy.
Say, if it's all about risk, which it is, and clients are frightened of risk, you've just got to point out the risk to them of getting a crap building or going bust. I mean, those are pretty big risks.
Yeah,
so if you want to talk their language, there it is.
Show them some failures.
One quick point, if I may.
Yeah.
We're slightly stuffed as a profession because we are unlike most other businesses, and I'm sceptical about this thing about SME engagement because 97% of UK practices are SMEs. It's meaningless. 70% are fewer than 10 people. So to say that you're engaging with SMEs is kind of meaningless because that's like what's the 250 people? You can be 250 people and still be an SME.
Maybe that would be the big change to procurement, a very small SME.
We've got a question right at the back.
It's rumoured, Malcolm, that your fee for the Holocaust Museum was, I won't state what the rumour was, but let's say it was very high. I think it's also a matter of fact that the economic value of the Labour Symposium, 2nd and 3rd of March, and the intellectual property of the architects who submitted that competition far exceeded that. So my question is not to you, but to the panel, which is, why do you think that architects so suicidally allow themselves to be exploited? And how do we stop that level of exploitation through the competition system? Because I'm afraid I'll be talking about this on the 3rd of March in the Labour about the way that architects so willingly seem to submit to their very exploitation, which seems to me such a serious thing for the profession. So I don't buy the arguments of the competition as a great release of young labour, because it's the exploitation of young labour. So I'd like to hear from the audience, from the panel, why they think that architects submit to this exploitation and what the solution might be.
That's really hard.
So, Russell.
Well, I mean, it seems to me that the design competitions are absolutely the worst form of procurement, apart from all the others. I think that's the fundamental issue. If you were to design a system of procurement, what would it be about? It would be about, for architects or for a building, it would be about design. And how do you best do that? And that is through demonstrating the best approach or the best design solution to that particular problem, not about all the other things that we've talked about, the turnover and all the rest of it. So I think that there is a fundamental issue. Architects love doing competitions. I mean, we started our practice on the back of winning competitions, which never got built but got us a bit of press at the time. And so I think they're a good thing. The problem is there's not enough of them, and they're not done well enough. And if you're competing against thousands of other practices, of course, that's a bonkers. It's like, if you went to your bank manager and said, I'm going to build a business off taking 10 grand and sticking it on a very large roulette wheel, I mean, you'd be laughed out of the bank. But this is what we do. And I think the thing is, we need to just have far more of them, and they need to be far better done. A reasonable amount of effort going into the process, and if there's lots of them, we won't all be competing against thousands of others. It will be a handful, and that seems like a reasonable way to do it.
Claire?
I think the thing is that architects should all just not enter. Now, that's really difficult, because I've spoken to brilliant, really good, famous architects who've said, but if we don't enter, Claire, then some really terrible people will all just enter who've got no... And so they just dread this idea that all those kind of random architects you've never heard of, sort of Killjoy, Carbuncle and Bland or whatever, kind of get the job. So they just enter anyway. And I think architects are wonderful, crazy, passionate, very silly people, and they just can't help themselves.
Malcolm, would you defend the competition culture?
I would say, what's the alternative? What's your bright idea for the alternative? Because, we're talking actually about some very, although it's a kind of passionate panel, the amount of value of construction sort of going through the four of us or anybody who's interested in competitions is infinitesimally small compared to the way that other things are procured in this country. So the alternative doesn't seem to be providing the profession with much either. And I think the evidence is, as you made at a very personal point, the evidence is that architects do enter our competitions and they are actually satisfied and they don't see it, and certainly has not been said to me, as a waste of time and money, because the system is something which gives them something back. And it's not throwing ideas away for no recompense. Firstly, the practices get experience, and secondly, is part of how architecture has been procured since time immemorial.
But I think Russell's right. Sorry, I think it is mad, actually, and I think the audience member is correct as well. I think, probably, just thinking it through, you probably just shouldn't be allowed to run a competition which is like that. You just...
I think there's a range. So there's a difference between a design team selection process where you go out and you get minimal information and you ask for 2 pages of ideas. And, I appointed Richard McCormack to do Bangkok based on an interview with an A3 board against other architects. And I think that's a reasonable one. I think if you are going to run a competition, I think it's beholden on you to limit the number of people who are shortlisted. I think that the honorarium needs to represent the amount of work that happens, and the process needs to be kept as short as possible. Because I think competition is good. I think there's always been competitions. It does improve work. And there's lots of lovely paintings around of the Bank of England shortlisted entries or ones for, so there's a long history of competitions.
Next question.
Well, thank you, Kay, for beginning to touch on what might be an alternative. And I'd just like to encourage the panel to think a bit harder on what we might do for procurement. This is a discussion about procurement. It isn't competition. It's astonishing to me that the whole discussion has been purely about competition, as if that's the only way that anyone can ever procure a building. And of course, that's mad. And what I think is a real problem for the profession is that the country at large is beginning to think that that is how you employ an architect, which has only fairly recently become more prevalent. And I'm worried that it's going to become de rigueur for anyone thinking they want a building, however small, to think that they should get a bunch of architects to do a load of work for free or very little money up front, parade it in front of a jury which is ill-prepared for the task, and choose one. And we all know that a good building comes out of proper engagement with the client body who are going to use it. And in conversations recently with bodies who have put very bad competitions together, I think the top competitions run internationally are not the issue. It's the fact that every small £1 million project is being procured that way in a way that is appalling. And actually, if we don't do something about it as a profession, this statistic that we don't quite know, but the percentage of 15, 20, 30% of our turnover going into pitching for work, not going into giving clients the good buildings they deserve, is simply going to get worse. So my question is, can you as a panel, think a bit harder about what the alternatives might be?
Right, time to do some work. What alternatives are there? Claire? I'm going to start that end.
I mean, but in the public sector, you've got to run some kind of competition. You cannot get out of that. So there it is. But you can, and other people have expressed it well, make it as absolutely lean, simple, quick, no nonsense requirements for 50-page QA manuals, etc. And this is where I boringly say I did do that twice at Peabody, and it worked, and we got great people, but the effort it took was extraordinary to get round the technical difficulties of that, but it was worth it. So in the public sector and the third sector, which is the one I'm used to, it must happen, but it is the duty of the people running those processes to make them incredibly lean. of course, if you're in the private sector, you can do what you like. You can, ring up your friends and say, do it, or you can run a small and skinny and interesting kind of competition. I think, I don't know what else to say on that, really. Go on.
I don't disagree with you. I mean, I think that, as I said, there's an increasing amount of things called competitions, which are in fact just kind of straight covered up tenders, where people are encouraged to in because it sounds like a competition, but then are asked to do things and, can you just have a look at this, and bring along a few drawings, and this goes all the way up to the top. I mean, there are big organisations that do this nowadays, which is a shame to see. But there are other ways to procure design, and there is at the other end of the scale, there's a lovely tale which Phyllis Lambert tells about procuring Mies van der Rohe for the Seagram building, which involved having a lunch with some advisors at the Four Seasons Hotel and a large number of martinis, and getting in a car in the afternoon and going around to see architects' offices. And although that sounds a wonderful experience, actually at the core of that, I think, is really an alternative, which, if it could be made to work in public procurement, is an excellent one, which is meeting architects in offices, going to see their buildings, talking about things, and by the end of that process of having come up with 2 or 3 architects who actually just want to have a conversation with. And at that point, everybody knows where they stand. And I think that is a very, very successful way to do it. But we just cannot, in the current structure, certainly for public sector. But we have done 1 or 2 of those processes, and it is very invigorating for both client and architect to get to know each other.
I'm keen to move on to the next question, but do you want to respond quickly?
I was just going to say, I think it's probably the reason that Alto didn't build more of his competitions, because actually the big part of procuring someone is the kind of relationship between the architect and the client, and if they haven't actually had a nice conversation beforehand, then it's very unlikely that they're going to work together long term well.
There's a question right at the back. Yeah.
Hi, Ellis Woodman, the Architecture Foundation. I guess this is primarily directed at Malcolm. There was a kind of, you remarked that one of the advantages of a practice entering competitions is about the publicity that they get, even if they don't win. In the last decade, it's felt that there's an increasing number of competitions where we never get to find out the other entries at all. I've never seen any scheme for the refurbishment of the Hayward and Queen Elizabeth Hall. I've never seen any scheme for the Olympicopolis site. Never seen anything for Tate 2. And none has yet seen anything at all for the Barbican's kind of music centre. Is it not kind of beholden on anyone running a competition for a kind of public building that process should be transparent, and that we should, as a society, be able to make our own judgment as to whether the right building has been chosen?
Yes, I'd support that actually very much. I mean, there are difficulties, and we ran Olympicopolis, and you are right, the schemes weren't exhibited, and that wasn't the intention at the beginning. The schemes were to be exhibited. And we try very hard to make sure that happens, and the client actually invests in making those submissions available. I know there are lots of criticisms about Guggenheim, but the Guggenheim organisation paid for a fantastic open access gallery of all the schemes, which is constantly being viewed. I mean, we're sort of up to 4.5 million hits, and these become a legacy. And I absolutely agree with you. I think it is something which should be part of the competition process, and is outside the UK. If you hold a competition, there is a commitment made to exhibit the schemes so that people can understand and take their own views, and your co-competitors can see which one. So I do support that, and we try to make sure that happens in the competitions we run.
Next question.
Hi, I'm Peter Ingalls from Cullinan Studio. Last week we sort of publicly, we decided not to enter a V&A competition because it was just the risk associated with that compared to the reward made no sense at all. But for competitions that you run, where there is for these all singing, all dancing competitions, the whole team will spend easily £50,000 on one of these competitions. What do you think is a fair honorarium for that work?
Very good question. Malcolm, I'm going to put it to you first.
Look, I think there are two answers to the question. One, I sort of apologise in advance because it's sort of going to be tangential, but one of the things I think for clients which perhaps we don't grasp is just how much it costs a client to run a competition. And so they invest quite heavily in that process. I think many clients are quite brave in having a competition. They put themselves out to sort of public ridicule of people not taking the competition seriously, and sort of, you know, some of the criticisms which I hear and I understand. So there's another side to the coin. I can see that. In terms of honoraria, I think that they should be a proper reflection on the costs of making an entry. And we, for the complex competitions we have now, the honoraria are getting greater and greater because we talk to the clients about just how much.
Give a figure. When you say greater and greater, what?
Well,
can you give an example?
I think the Guggenheim was actually €90,000 for stage 2 competitors. So, and the first stage was actually limited to a small number of boards. But the second stage got 90,000.
Can I put the question to the practicing architect on the panel? Yeah, I guess the example was £50,000 worth of work. What would you be prepared for honorarium?
Because we've just done a competition with Malcolm Redick, and which we won, and we got £10,000 honorarium, which was nowhere near the amount of work that 6 of us put in.
And that was for winning, months,
including a film. And it was for the National Infrastructure Commission, who a month later released a call for designs for roadways where they were willing to pay the transport engineers £30,000 each. So, you know, I was pretty upset when I saw that and felt that, you know, the competition should definitely be rewarded better.
It's a trick. I don't think that architects really enter competition. They shouldn't enter competitions expecting to win, and therefore, you know, the honorarium that they receive if they're lucky to get shortlisted is always going to be an insult. But it's not. But you know, that's not the reason. That's not the reason to do it. So I think, you know, whether you said it was, you know, 5,000, 10,000, 50,000, you know, 50,000 would be nice. It's unlikely to happen. I think what is more important, that there is a commitment within the competition to keep the initial, if it's 2 stages, to keep the initial stage down as light as possible, and to build the bloody thing. I mean, that's the fundamental issue, that we see all these competitions that people are winning left, right, and centre, and then nothing happens. You know, and the publicity is great, but actually, if there was a commitment to build at the end of it, or at least then, if it's not going to be built, you give the fee, the equivalent fee to the practice that's won the competition, then, you know, that would sort of reform it slightly.
Yeah.
Anyway,
next question.
Hi, it's actually more of a response to all of the comments on the panel. Claire, you were saying that you don't think there is a way round the procurement, and that, you know, it's set in our law. But borrowing some of Russell's statistics, as I understand it, in this country we procure 2% of our projects through negotiated procedure and about 81% through 2-stage competitive tender. In Germany, it's 82% that are negotiated and 2% that are actually done the other way round. And funnily enough, Germany is one of the cheapest and one of the fastest, whereas we are the second slowest, as you said, after Greece and Malta, and we're also the second most expensive after Norway and Iceland. So there are better ways to do it, and as Russell said, it's not to do with EU regulation, it's to do with the British getting off its obsession with bureaucracy. And then, you know, in terms of Malcolm's comments, I just thought I'd read from his website, if that's all right. This is for clients. It is a cost-effective method of developing an initial design concept and finding the right team. Furthermore, it is usually good value for money, because the client can also use the buzz and creativity released by the competition to achieve other organisational goals and improve their public profile. So, you know, I think it's for all of us to fight back against that. It's okay to say we get publicity out of it, but what's happening, and our own profession does it. I've been an RIBA competition advisor, and I did that because I was so frustrated at how it was run, and it's shocking. It's absolutely shocking, the exploitation. The competition that I judged was for a bridge, over 100 entries, open. Students could enter. Now, students in the room might be horrified at this. Their profession advised the client when we were about to shortlist one of the students that, we'll be very careful. That's a student. They might not be able to win it. So, of course, you know, we got round that and advised them. The next thing was the honorarium. The honorarium was ridiculously low. I said I thought it wasn't sufficient. The client said, fine, what would you suggest? I recommended 5 times what the RIBA was recommending, and the client didn't bat an eyelid and paid it. So we need to change things from within. And then, you know, going on to Russell's comments, I think he had the answer for how we can run competitions better. You know, the Dutch example is not that hard to do. It doesn't cost a lot of money to run. It doesn't cost a lot of money to enter. We have a partnership practice in Holland, quite common. And we have actually experienced it in this country where we were actually asked by land securities, you know, big behemoth of a client you'd expect would want loads of stuff. We had to do one A3 sheet of our idea, and we sent a picture of Ludlow and a line from a poem, and we won it. So it can be done, and they got a great service out of it. And then I think the final point...
you to wrap up. So
okay, last one for Kay. We're Reform Architects, so we're behind Rotherhithe Bridge. We're not a large practice. We're an SME. We started it not knowing anyone. It's not to do with contacts. All the contacts and effort has come from the process over 4.5 years of work. And the TfL have chosen a process which excludes us when they could choose several other processes. Thank you.
Okay, 2 more questions. There's one there, and then the final one at the back. Would you begin here?
Hi, yes, I'm from outside the profession, so I feel a bit like I've entered a parallel universe. It just seems such a bizarre way. I mean, I'm a journalist, and I can imagine if I had to compete for every article that I wrote. It's completely weird. But which brings me to a couple of points, really. I mean, really what I'm concerned about, and I think most of the people who are architecture students in this room are going to be working mainly on those 84% or whatever it was that aren't competitions. That they're either going to be in a design team with a developer, with a contractor, and be on a design and build or negotiated or whatever. Russell, you said it's about the design, and I'm not sure it is about the design. Mm-hmm. You know, I would feel I was more, you know, with what Claire was saying, as part of the public, I'm the client, and what I want is to have a relationship with the designer, and the designer won't... I mean, the idea of actually just sending a competition out to say, what do I want? I mean, I should know what I want. Yeah. I should have worked out what I want. I mean, it just makes me want to sit next to Sarah as well. Sorry, I'm being rambling a bit, but that her late and great father was a local authority architect. I mean, why aren't there local authority architects departments anymore? And if the EU process doesn't make that possible, whatever, how can the procurement process actually be about a relationship between the client and all those people Claire put up on that marvellous slide right at the beginning? I mean, that has to be a process. Yeah. And to sort of put a big wall down the middle and have a competition seems absolutely potty. But even if you're not doing a competition, how can that relationship be what happens?
Very good question.
So just to be clear, I'm not for 1 minute suggesting that the design is the be-all and end-all. The fundamental problem is that the procurement process and the procurement profession sees
commissioning as an end in itself, rather than a longer process to get to an outcome. And that outcome should be, as I said it earlier in my presentation, it should be, how does the building perform in 25, 50 years' time? What is it like to be in? What is it, do people enjoy being there? Is it sustainable? Is it functional? All of these things. And we've managed to lose that connection, and everything should be focused on the long-term outputs. And the design is one point on that journey, but I'm not for 1 minute suggesting that is an end in itself. I think that there has to be some kind of competitive process. Otherwise, it's not fair. I mean, in public commissioning, there has to be a competitive process. And the idea, the fundamental issue we need to get to grips with is, how do we make that fair, but also make sure that the outcome is serving the people that will use that building in the long term?
Claire, how can you combine the two?
In my sort of fantasy world, and it's a bit of a sad one, sorry about that, but if I was a local authority procuring some developers, what I'd really like to see is that developer having to say, answer all the usual questions, but also then have take us round something you've finished, introduce us to the residents, and actually have a resident survey that says, what do you think of this building? And preferably it would be sort of 5, 10, 15 years old, because it is all about that long term. If I'm building something on public land, it's got to be blooming good, and it's got to be good, sorry to talk about Peabody, but 150 years later, it's got the same sash windows in it. How amazing is that? That is value for money. So if residents and building managers have to be asked for their comments on that developer's building, then that would and that's the only way that developer could get access to public land, that would be pretty compelling.
Okay. And then we'll take the final.
My perfect procurement process would be asking for a few ideas and approach, going to the architect's office, going out on the bus and seeing what they've done, and then getting rid of scoring. Because I think that, choosing architecture is about an evaluative process, and it should never be scored. I think that's just, if you can change one thing in the procurement process, it would be getting rid of scoring.
Okay, we're over time, so this is going to have to be the last question right at the back.
Hi, Will Hurst from the Architects Journal. I was interested in the points that Khaa made and Russell about the economic waste that this all entails, and perhaps even an effect on UK productivity. These are the sort of things that governments are usually very alert to. So my question is, why is nobody in power aware of this or thinking about it? I don't believe it's anything to do with Brexit dominating their every waking moment, because these sort of issues were there well before we went down that road. So is it a lack of lobbying? Is it that we have no voice in this sector that is actually effective in Whitehall with ministers? Why are we not being heard?
Oh, very good question. Or is there too much lobbying from the wrong sector?
I don't think we're very good at measuring it. I think that's the problem. We're not very good at assessing the actual cost and then articulating that to the people in power. That seems to be the fundamental issue, that we just don't seem to be able to find a way of describing exactly how ridiculous this situation is, how costly. And
in that case, do we need to, partner up with some economic policy wonks or some think tanks or the Treasury Select Committee or something like that?
I think there needs to be a bit of a benchmarking exercise. I mean, one of the reasons it hasn't happened is because most practices are pretty small and they're spending all the time bidding. The things I said that you need to do is find out how much practices are spending on it, how much procurement offices and groups in public procurement are spending on it, how much time the clients are spending on it, and then just take that as a percentage of the spend. And it's going to be very high. And if you put that as an economic argument to government, they would rethink.
So it's just not being made at the moment, that argument?
I don't think it is, no. No one has thought about it in economic terms. Everybody's thought about it in terms of how much work they've been doing. It's a lot of effort, but no one's looked at the big picture and said, well, actually, this is a drag on the economy.
If you'll forgive me, there's a brief plug.
We are, at the moment, undertaking an exercise on through our website, through Project Compass, to try and establish the cost to small businesses of tendering and entering competitions. So if there are any practitioners out there who would be willing to contribute to this, because I'm hoping that Will might be able to also spread the word a bit.
Very happy to.
But if we need to do this, we need to go through this exercise, because I think there's a lot of work done around very large firms and how much it costs them, but actually not very much done around SMEs, and that's something we really need to capture, because SMEs are such a huge part of the UK architectural market. It's a massive sort of black hole that we don't really know about. So please fill out our survey.
I think Ollie's point was well made. I think there are some vested interests and people that have got a vice-like grip on this whole thing. Everyone can bash lawyers, and some of them are my friends, as it were, and I don't want to do that. But there are just consultants and lawyers and procurement people and so on who believe that they're doing the right thing by their clients, and I just think they've got a grip on it. But I think your point's well made, and I haven't thought about it before.
Malcolm, do you want to respond?
I would say it's a problem for the whole construction industry. It's not just architects. Any tendering process for contractors or for engineers or whatever takes a substantial investment. I think, competitions, there's been a lot talked about competition. I don't think competitions are the right form of procurement for every single project. I think they're for very special projects and where there is a possibility to sort of build up some kind of benefit that will come to those who enter. But I accept what you say, Will. I think, but it should be something which is across the whole construction industry, because that is probably the way to get government to notice, because involving the contractors and other parts of the supply chain.
Fantastic. Well, the discussion is going to continue in the bar, which is outside and to the left. There are still tickets available for the two-day symposium next Friday and Saturday on architecture and labour. And can I please ask you to thank our wonderful panel who've made a full house of procurement.